The iPhone X was a divisive little creature, that's for sure. I mean, some people loved it, a lot of people hated it. When it released in October 2017, yeah, I know, it's been almost 2 years, kind of crazy, I don't know where the heck the time goes. But when it came out, there was a lot of buzz about it. On one hand, it had these super slim bezels around the sides and the bottom, and on the other, it had this huge, thick notch at the top. Furthermore, Apple executed the home button and Touch ID altogether and decided to go with Face ID, which is a facial recognition system. While it made for a somewhat cleaner design overall, with no home button or fingerprint reader on the back, I mean, people weren't too keen on losing their beloved buttons and scanners. And I get that. Of course, the iPhone X wasn't cheap either. It started at around $1,000 for the 64GB version. But if we fast forward to 2019, that's back, isn't it? Forward. But if we fast forward to 2019, where the price of a used iPhone X has dwindled to around $500 or $600 refurbished, is it worth buying? Yeah, maybe. I was actually really impressed when we did some performance tests on this phone, which you'll see a little bit later, but first, let's start with the design. Overall, I think the iPhone X is an attractive phone. Yes, it's got that big, ugly notch at the top, but if you can get past that, everything else looks great. It's got very slim bezels at the sides and the bottom, as I mentioned before, and the display has those rounded corners that I've really grown to love. The display doesn't really bleed off the edges like a lot of the new phones nowadays, but I mean, to be honest, I'm starting to like that. I'm getting a little sick of the bleeding edge design anyway, but that might be just me. The phone is IP67 water and dust resistant, and I've never really had to worry about getting my phone wet. Actually, I'm a bit of a germaphobe, and I put my phone in the sink sometimes just to wash it, so if you're worried about how waterproof this phone is, just don't be. Just don't go swimming or scuba diving with it or something. The iPhone X is a bit of a hefty phone. It comes in at around 174 grams, and in comparison to the S10, which is about the same size, it's only 157 grams. The weight's not a big deal, your wrist isn't going to be like hurting at the end of the day or something because your phone's too heavy, but it is something to note if you prefer more light phones. I said prefer, I meant prefer, but you know what I mean. A lot of that weight comes from the glass that surrounds the entire phone. While it gives the phone a sort of premium look and feel and allows for wireless charging, it does make it a lot less durable than something like an iPhone 7, which had an aluminum back. I actually recommend keeping a case on this phone at all times. You might not get to show off that shiny, fingerprinty Apple logo at the back, but trust me, your phone is a lot more safe and it looks a lot better in a case than it does if you eventually drop this phone and shatter it completely. Just my 2 cents. If you own an iPhone X and you want to know some great cases to buy, I'll leave links for it down in the description down below. We do have two 12 megapixel cameras on the back of the X that create this odd oval shaped camera bump. Unfortunately, this actually does leave the phone a little bit uneven when placed on a flat surface, so I guess that's another reason to buy a case. I'll show off the camera performance a little later, but first I want to talk about my favorite part of the phone as a whole, the display. The iPhone X has a 5.8-inch 1125 by 2436 OLED display that has a pixel density of around 458 ppi or pixels per inch. It's a very sharp display with amazing color, and it's packed with a load of goodies. First of all, it uses the P3 color profile, meaning it has a very wide color gamut and can reproduce colors very vividly and very accurately. Apple also employs their True Tone color adjustment thingy here. Basically, the display can just change its color balance to match your environment that you want it to. It's neat, I actually do like it a lot. The display also has HDR10 and Dolby Vision support too, so HDR movies look great on the display. Blacks are actually black because of the OLED panel, and if you do a lot of content consumption on this phone, whether it be movies or TV or YouTube, you'll probably be happy with the colors and contrast on the X. The display also has what's called a 120Hz touch sample rate. That doesn't mean the display actually runs at 120Hz. A lot of people make that mistake. The display is still only 60Hz like most other phones. I won't get into the specifics because it's kind of hard to explain, but what you need to know that the animations will feel faster than they do on other phones, but it'll still look like a 60Hz display. The last thing to note about the display is that it has 3D touch. This is Apple's moniker for a pressure-sensitive display. In some cases, you can press harder on some things in the software and it will do something different. For example, if you just press regularly on the flashlight, it turns on. But if you press harder, it'll bring up the brightness level control. It's an intuitive function and I like it a lot. A few more last minute notes to make about the design before we get into the camera performance. There's no headphone jack here, as is the case with all Apple phones after the 6, and it uses the proprietary lightning cable to charge the phone, no USB-C. And finally, no, the notch is not a big deal. It's not as intrusive as you might think, and it only becomes annoying when trying to watch videos in full screen. Luckily, you can stop the 10 from expanding the screen into the notch in most video players, so I don't really mind the notch at all. I mean, people make a big deal out of it, but it's really not that bad. The notch is a necessary evil. There's actually a lot more going on inside that notch than you might first realize. Of course, you do have that front-facing 7-megapixel selfie camera and a speaker that works in tandem with the bottom speaker to create, above average stereo sound, but that's not the most interesting hardware inside the notch. In order to register and scan your face to use with Face ID, Apple used what they call the True Depth system. It consists of 3 different pieces of hardware that sit inside that notch. There's the flood illuminator, which actually lights up your face with infrared light, the dot projector, which sends out 30,000 little IR dots, and then the infrared camera, which captures that projection created by the dot projector and then gives the phone the 3D map required to determine who is attempting to unlock the phone. It's actually a really cool little system, and though it did have a poor reputation to start, I can happily say that it's gotten much better in the couple of years that we've had it. The front-facing selfie camera isn't all that great though, it's kind of mediocre really. Like I said, it's only a 7-megapixel camera and it only records up to 1080p at 30 FPS in the video mode. It does have a portrait mode that uses software to blur the background, and while it does work decently well, it's definitely not as good as something like the new S10s or the Pixel 3s. The rear cameras are quite a bit better. There's a 28mm wide-angle lens at f1.8 and a 52mm telephoto lens at f2.4. Both have 12-megapixel sensors and shoot up to 4K at 60 FPS or 1080p at 240 FPS. While these cameras do fall a bit behind the newer phone cameras like the aforementioned S10 and Pixel 3, they do still hold up very well in 2019 with excellent color reproduction and image quality. Stabilization is also good in the video mode and definitely only stands to get better over time with more software updates. Alrighty then, let's talk about the internals and how they make the phone perform. The iPhone X was released with Apple's hexa-core A11 Bionic CPU. It's a fast little 10nm chip and it holds up very well today. The downside is that the CPU is paired with a mere 3GB of RAM, which, I mean, it looked horrible on paper even when it was released in late 2017. Surprisingly though, the iPhone X doesn't perform like a phone with only 3GB of RAM. I've had this phone for a long while now, and I've noticed very few slowdowns, even when having a lot of apps open at once. iOS might have a lot of flaws, but RAM management's not one of them. The 10 is able to open a multitude of apps with very little effort. I mean, everyday use just feels very snappy and responsive, and the phone is able to open the largest of apps quickly and with ease. After you open more than 5 or 6 apps at a time, Apple does reset some of the smaller apps like Twitter or Instagram to conserve RAM, but since those apps open very fast anyway, it's not a big deal. The 10 performed admirably with a single core score of 4215 and 10157 in multi-core inside of Geekbench 4 and an Antutu score of around 240,000. These are very respectable numbers, and in terms of everyday use, the iPhone X can hang with the best of phones. Trust me, I know, it's every bit as fast as my Note 9. There's a catch though. Though the performance is up to snuff, the battery life is just not. Apple threw a 2700 mAh battery in there, which in my opinion just isn't enough. While I can get a full day out of this phone, many of you won't. Your mileage is gonna vary. I mean, I don't use my phone nearly as much as some of you guys, so for me, it's fine, but for some of you that watch a lot of YouTube or other media on your phone, you're gonna be a little disappointed. It does support fast charging though, up to 50% in 30 minutes, so that's not too bad I guess, but I definitely would have preferred a bigger battery. The other gotcha is storage. Apple only offers 2 versions, the 64GB version and the 256GB version, and neither of them have expandable storage. Apple is constantly trying to drive home the need for their iCloud services and even send you push notifications if you're running low on it. If you're the type of person that plays a lot of mobile games or you download a lot of TV shows or movies or anything like that, go for the large storage option. Just be aware that you're going to be paying quite a bit more for it. And that perfectly brings us to the last point, the price. When it started out in 2017, the $1,000 iPhone X was a much harder phone for me to recommend to anybody. But now that you can get it for nearly half that, it's a much better value. There are some things to consider though. First of all, you can't buy the 10 new from Apple anymore, but you can buy it refurbished from them and get the 1-year Apple Care warranty for free. The thing is, they still charge nearly $800 for it. So my recommendation if you are interested in buying the iPhone X is to get it from sites like eBay or Craigslist. Just make sure the seller is reputable and ask for the IMEI number so that you can find out if the phone has been stolen through services like imei.info or device check. The other thing to think about is if you really want an iPhone. I mean, if you're more of an Android person, Samsung's S10e or Google's Pixel 3a are both excellent phones, and they cost a little bit more and a little bit less than a used iPhone 10 respectively. But if you're an iOS lover, the value of a used iPhone 10 right now is tough to argue against. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to support my channel, and as always, have a great day.